other one, you bastard!
Brought to you by supporters who probably have better taste than this schmuck.
Third-party Legends is currently bigger than ever. Although some of the old titans are falling through the cracks by not moving with the times, on the whole, the niche is bigger than it's ever been. Even Hasbro is taking notice, reverting back from Micromasters to Legends figures to great success. Although that's a story for another time. A story that should have been shortly after this, but, you know. Given the runaway success of this niche, one would have to ask, why hasn't Hashtag jumped on this trend? Why don't they make high-end, small-scale figures? Well, aside from the product type being fairly difficult to break into, as lucrative as it may seem, people often forget they've already tried. 15 years ago, Takara initiated the Hybrid Style Initiative, and crashed and burned harder than Babylon's Fall. Call it a literal Babylon's Fall, if you will, because the first figure couldn't even stand up. Now, half of this story has already been catalogued on this channel. Despite enlisting the help of the Macross Valkyrie's designer, their G1 Optimus was plagued with countless issues. Shitty plastic, misused die-cast, build quality issues that f***ed with the joints, a truly abysmal transformation, bits constantly falling off. Hybrid Style Convoy was essentially Satan's checklist of action figure f***ups. However, the other half of that story hasn't been covered in great detail. Part of the reason is because it's far more rare and expensive. G1 Convoy had the original release, 2 separate black editions, and a platinum reissue, because of course platinum reissued it. When have they ever had any good ideas? Okay, I'll give you that one. As far as Galaxy Convoy was concerned, though, it was the original version, and that was it. It's no wonder the eBay prices are bloody ridiculous. For years and years, this was considered a grail of mine, a highly articulated, legend-scaled Cybertron Prime. That has to be awesome, even with the fumblings of the G1 version. Well, I've finally made it. I've reached the promised land and found a copy that doesn't cost me a kidney. And now that it's over, yeah, I can see why this line crashed and burned. Greetings, Cybertronians. I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Hybrid Style THS-01 Galaxy Convoy, also known as Legend Scale Cybertron Optimus Prime. Not to be confused with Legends of Cybertron Optimus Prime, although, to be honest, despite the lower price, I think it might be a better deal in the end. Now, it's no stretch to call Cybertron Optimus Prime's truck mode iconic amongst Transformers fans. Is it? Maybe it's my nostalgia talking, given how much I watched the show as a kid, but I've always been under the impression that a lot of people have fondness for this design. Regardless, it's got its own special feel to it that's hard to lose, even through reinterpretation. So, why does the hybrid style version feel muted in comparison? On first glance, and even up close in many instances, everything seems to be in order. It's a very faithful recreation for the most part, only adding the designer's giantess fetish into the mix. Yes, it definitely looks like an Amogus with stretched legs sitting down, but that's always been how this mode has looked, so there isn't much to complain about there. In fact, a lot of this mode's faults can be written off given the accuracy to the original, such as the hinges on the top, the exposed matrix cavity, visible head, and feet sticking out the top. Even stuff like sliding rails being used on the side makes more sense, because how else are you going to accomplish that transformation trick at this size? Plus, it isn't on a load-bearing joint, so it's not going to do the usual sliding rail thing of breaking down over time. Oh hi, Black Convoy! The paint is also absolutely exquisite. Admittedly, the die-cast refuses to color match the base plastic, but that's not going to be noticeable under the trailer anyway, so it's hardly something to complain about. The individual paint applications are plentiful also, with tons of details picked out. Even if it's just following the original layout, it's still important to acknowledge the deco designer went above and beyond. Even the yellow is near flawless, a remarkable achievement given the difficulty in getting that color right. And the mechanical detail, fuck me, this is some good shit. Shrinking down the toyetic panel lines onto a toy this small means it's incredibly intricate. Again, this could have easily been simplified, but they chose not to. Massive kudos. So, the figure is built well, sculpted well, and painted well, so what could be wrong with it? Well, for starters, how does the engineering fare in this mode? That's how. Diecast is heavy. Hell, let's simplify that a bit. Metal is heavy. Anyone who's picked up a piece of metal in their life will know it's dense. It's not some big earth-shattering revelation, this is just simple facts. On a small, simple Legends figure, the plastic is light enough to rely on friction to keep the legs in place. With the larger version, the ratchets accomplish this. On the Galaxy Upgrade homage, they use proper tabs, as is common with modern-day figures. Hybrid-style Galaxy Convoy uses none of these. When you have a vehicle mode, the general standard should be that everything locks solidly into place. I know Cybertron Cybertron was sort of a transitionary period between the gimmikified bricks of old and the more articulated design-driven bots of the new, but I can't think of any figure off the top of my head that had structural issues like this in vehicle mode from this time. Well, I can think of one, but that's not really Hector's case. I'm not opposed to the use of die-cast in Legends figures. I used to see its inclusion as stupid, but after examining it in the smallest Transforming Transformers collection, as well as several inspired uses in New Age, I've come to see its benefits. So the problem isn't that it has die-cast, it's just that it doesn't have locking tabs. This isn't some whiz-bang wacky engineering system that needs thinking out of the box, it's basic Transformer Design 101. The die-cast also causes another issue. For some bizarre reason, the designers have decided to include the spring-loaded wheel gimmick from the original. What happens when you combine die-cast and spring-loaded gimmicks? If you answered weight issues, congratulations, you actually thought this through, unlike whoever was designing this. Getting this guy to roll properly is basically impossible, even with the use of rubber tires. I appreciate that the tires here aren't impossibly thin, making them fall off during even gentle sessions of play, but no amount of ground grip is going to overcome the weight distribution. And sure, this issue is rectified once you add the trailer, since the weight is shifted to these wheels instead. Some might not even consider this an issue anyway, as a lot of people consider the individual truck mode an afterthought, but as someone who grew up primarily on the Legends class version and not the full scale one, I'm just disappointed in the lack of care here. These issues are so easy to fix. Add the tabs on the crotch plate and remove the spring gimmick and boom!
You're done!
But no, preserving accuracy to a fault is far more important. As we've seen with modern third-party entries, you can be perfectly accurate whilst still delivering a fun experience. All you have to do is pick and choose what to include from the original. Sometimes things just don't translate well over. The lack of understanding there echoes what we've seen with Black Convoy prior, only fortunately on a lesser scale. Still, none of these issues compare to what I consider the worst. They done f***ed up the windows! I know this may seem innocuous, but I want you to examine the other versions again. No frame, no frame, no frame. When juxtaposed with the mean front bumper, it ends up pushing this feeling of raw power. But when you decide to expand the coverage of the white section, turning it into a full window frame, it just ends up removing that feeling. I'm perfectly fine with designs moving away and doing their own thing, but this isn't a toy that's trying to do that. When you go accurate on the whole thing and then fall flat in the most prominent section, it kinda just dampens the whole experience. It's sorta like MP52 Starscream. Ignoring all of the build quality and articulation issues, you've got this hyper-accurate body and then they f*** it over with the face sculpt. Yes, this toy is pretty small, but the principle still remains the same. Plus, this isn't a cheap figure. Its price was comparable to many third-party Legends figures today, and that's not even factoring inflation into the mix. You expect a certain level of class here, and the front section having unnecessary window frames that are counterproductive to the aesthetic kinda ruins that. Even adding the trailer doesn't take away from it. Yes, your attention isn't focused squarely on the f***ery up front, but the issue doesn't just go away. Oh well, at least the aesthetic is still pretty neat. None of the badassery has been lost in the transition to baby mode. The guns still look mean as f***, going even harder than the normal Takara version of the Leader class release, with the extra silver not seen on the Hasbro version. They actually have some neat automorph at play, snapping back into place from their flight mode configuration with the press of a button. Kinda wish that effort was put into other parts of the figure, but it's still neat to see. And something I greatly appreciate is the inclusion of fully functioning cyber key gimmicks. You get 2 tiny keys in this set, and they function identically to the Leader counterparts. Legit, this is awesome. Well, the blaster one slightly less so since there are no molded missiles, but it's still amazing this was included at all, especially after the recent Unicorn Trilogy figures cut it out for the sake of the budget, allocating such to the articulation. Don't get me wrong, that decision was for the best, but this here shows that a lot of the time the designers really cared about bringing this figure to life. It also hints that the failures aren't due to negligence, but rather being misguided, though it can be hard to tell at times. Still, once you bring in the included articulation into the mix, on top of the extra side guns, the magic from this figure finally shines through. And hey, now that the weight distribution issues have been fixed, we can finally roll this guy into battle. Oh, the wings don't tab in, so the wheels now fold out to the sides. Okay, so with this issue, I can kinda cut him some slack. This was an issue with the original design as well, and the benefit of hindsight isn't really there when this figure was designed. We're not dealing with a remake years down the track. Hybrid style only came out 2 years after the original, in a time when engineering progress wasn't accelerating at the rate it is today. I can see why they'd forget something like this, so although it's a valid issue, it's fine. You can always hold it from the back as you move it, and rolling it around is quite fun. And even stationary, it makes an imposing piece with substantial size and awesome mechanical detail, just barely overcoming the window kerfuffle. Plus, as fans of this design will know, there's always the flight mode to engage with. And why do the guns not fully face forward? Okay, I take back any goodwill I had about the automorph. If it's a design like this, I don't want it. Honestly, I'm pretty torn about this mode. The few good qualities he has shine incredibly brightly, those being the paint and sculpt. You can tell they've spared no expense here, but you can also tell the priorities are incredibly warped. Obviously, it's nowhere near as heinous as the G1 version, but it's still lacking in a bunch of areas. Look, if you're a display-oriented Legends collector, to which I would ask, why? What's the point of that? Then it'll do. It's a nice little centerpiece amongst the other Legends of Cybertron figures, and it could probably go alongside some of the stylized Iron Factory stuff. If you're looking for the perfect Legends representation of this alt mode though, well, sorry, guess you're up creek. Seriously, if someone made a 3D printed trailer for the Legends version, it'd probably be a better option than this. Doubly so with the price it goes for these days. Oh mama! Ah well, at present, no one has done that yet. Until we get better options on the market, it occupies a similar space to the alt mode of Iron Factory Drift. A few points of charm, but definitely flawed, though ultimately, it'll do if we never get another version. Technically speaking, all the steps between this and the full-scale version are pretty much the same. Every chunk moves in the exact same way, every piece ends up in the exact same place, but for some reason, it just feels underdone in comparison. It doesn't really make much sense considering they already did that on the Legends of Cybertron version, and it worked fine. But for some bizarre reason, there are just little changes with this one that don't end up working. Of course, the first thing you want to do is bring the legs down like so, bring the hip skirt down with them, and then something a little bit different because we don't have the spring-loaded gimmick. What you want to do is bring these out a little bit, then rotate them down, and then push it in together. Slightly different, but it does work for the size. Just be careful because there are separate sockets and separate ball joints inside here, and they can come undone pretty easily. So just be careful as you're doing it. But anyway, separate the legs like so. Then the one original step that this guy has, you want to separate these two tabs from these parts here, holding the whole thing together with the waist joint. Of course, it wasn't necessary on the original because there wasn't a waist joint. Bring the arms down like so. Come to the front, and we have sliding rails to bring these to the front like that, and then they close up. Sort of like the original, but sort of not. Difference being instead of there being a double hinge, it's sliding rails. But these sliding rails I don't really mind, considering they're not on load-bearing joints, and even if they become loose over time, there are still locking points for them, and it's fine. And they lock into each other here, so who really cares? It's not going to be a problem for longevity. Separate the arms like that. Then you got double hinges, just like the original, and they rotate around to the front, and they clip into place like so. The arms, of course, rotate around into their regular position, and then you come around to the back, and you can see that you've got sliding rails that these actually slide up on, and this is actually going to cause problems later, unlike the chest. Oh, that fell off, but that doesn't really happen very often. Falling off isn't really the issue, it's more about the way they're situated, but I'll get to that in the robot mode, provided I can get this thing back on, come on. And of course, last but not least, you want to bring up the head, but this actually functions a little bit differently. You pull this down and then push the whole thing up like so, and then it pushes down into itself again, locking it into place. Gotta say, this is the one part of the transformation that I prefer over the original. The original is just a sliding joint, so it kinda can break down over time and have the head sag into the torso. Not with my copy, but I have heard it's happened. But with this way, it's actually got something that locks it into place solidly. Not with tabs, but with friction that functions. So yeah, good job, hybrid style Galaxy Convoy, you actually did something well. But the rest of it, I don't know, it just feels like a massive downgrade. Don't get me wrong, I can't call this a bad transformation because it's almost the same as a really good one. It's ultimately serviceable, but as a fun toy to transform, it doesn't really hit that mark. Again, like I've kind of hinted at earlier, they're going more for the accuracy than the spirit of the original. The spirit of the original is a big, chunky, fun transformer, something which, ironically, once again, the Legends of Cybertron version did quite well. But that simple joy is just lost here. Again, not a bad transformation, but not really capturing the essence of Cybertron Optimus Prime. In robot mode, yeah, once again, I'm really conflicted. Unlike the previous modes though, it's not really a bunch of small issues and a few strong positives, but rather a lot of peaks and one pretty egregious valley. Most of the minuscule nitpicks can be forgiven in the context of Hybrid Star's release, but that one issue, it kinda sours the experience. Once again though, the paintwork and sculpt work has been knocked out of the park. Now that the windows are on the side and out of sight, this thing just screams Cybertron Optimus Prime. From head to toe, this guy just oozes the chunkiest clunkiness of the original design. And yes, it's hard to fuck up this style anyway, but I have to say they've done a real bang-up job. The head sculpt cannot be described as anything other than on the money. You don't get any of the bloat found on the G1 version, just pure brow power over here. Also, wow, how the hell did the ears snap off this? Is the plastic really that wibbly? Honestly, I don't remember this happening, but whatever. Not a figure I really care for anyway. The torso also gets right on point with those perfectly angular inward hexagons. Dig how they've highlighted the top lights, giving a bit of unnecessary but greatly appreciated extra flair. It even opens up to reveal a ridiculously tiny matrix of leadership. I'm, not going to remove that after this video. I don't trust myself, I'm just going to lose it. Moving down, the power boots work as well as you'd expect. They've got some hefty die-cast on the front portions to keep the balance working properly. Works much better than the full-leg die-cast of the G1 version, since there aren't any sliding rails relying on metal parts that will break the plastic over time. Although don't worry, we'll get to that in due season. In the meantime though, the silver comes through insanely well, keeping the premium feel at maximum levels. The materials used and the paint applied really shows where the budget for this thing went. Again, it's not a toy where they've spared any expense. Given the last review I did, it's a nice change of pace. Admittedly, I do kinda wish he had a thigh swivel instead of a knee swivel, much like the original. It was probably entirely possible given the engineering, but I can imagine the designers were hesitant on this. This was pretty much Takara's first ever collector grade small scale transformer, predating the G1 version in the lineup. As such, I can see why they would have had plastic solidity concerns. They also chickened out on the waist swivel, surrounding it with protective kibble so that it doesn't get damaged. Annoying, but hey, neither of the original versions had a waist swivel. We wouldn't see one until the Siege release, so it's hardly something to get angry about. And hey, the rest of the articulation works well enough. He's not really missing anything aside from a proper ankle tilt, as the toes are really just there for aesthetic, letting the die-cast weight hold him in place instead. Not particularly something to get angry over though. The way the legs transform doesn't really facilitate a proper ankle tilt, especially at the time this came out. So with most of the figure seeming bang on, what's there to complain about? The few issues surrounding it seem to make sense in the release year of 2006, going well above the standard of the time. What could possibly f this mode over? Well, tell me, why the f is there die-cast in the shoulders? Okay, so when the original hybrid-style Black Convoy review came out, and I mean the review specifically, not the original figure release, die-cast in Legends figures wasn't all that common. To be honest, for the most part, it still isn't, but that's beside the point. The only point of reference I had was this bullshit interpretation, where they used die-cast pieces in junction with sliding rails. A ridiculous decision, really. The results speak for themselves. In the few short years since this figure's review, not even having this figure on display, this is the best I can do with the robot mode. Absolutely pathetic. That said, New Age has since taken the charge by incorporating incredibly tasteful applications. These rebalance figures so that standing them works much better. Now, I'm aware in recent years there's been a growing push against the inclusion of diecast, claiming it's naught but a budget booster allowing companies to create a false sense of weight and charge extra.
You know, if you want to quote one of my controversial takes, I'd appreciate it if you gave me the credit for it. I thrive on the chaos it would bring me.
Well, I was trying to be polite. Anonymity is often preferable in these instances.
Screw you! Send them off to my door!
Look, point is, people took a look at a lot of the fans' toys releases and their somewhat dubious uses of unnecessary diecast and developed a distaste for it. While I understand that, and while I used to feel the same way for Legends figures at least, that opinion has subsided. Hell, on this figure we've seen a great example of such in the legs. So, what was the problem with hybrid-style Black Convoy? Diecast meets load-bearing joints and sliding rails. And what's the problem with hybrid-style Galaxy Convoy? Diecast meets load-bearing joints and sliding rails. For some bizarre reason, the fronts of the shoulders are cast completely in die-cast. While the paint covering it works really well, especially considering the difficulty in painting red, it means there's no real way to lock them in place. The joint that connects them is really thin, since it can't be pinned into the metal.
Why isn't it possible?
It's just not.
Why not, you stupid bastard?
Either way, this places all the load on the back, which also uses the insanely tiny peg to keep it locked in place. And it's held together using clear plastic, which breaks down over time. Who thought this was a good idea? You know how Black Convoy had the leg issue? Well, imagine that, but on the shoulders. Don't know if it's better or worse, but either way, considering the underside is hollow as it's basically ruined its longevity. If you leave it on a shelf and never bump it at all, sure, it may be fine. But better hope you don't live in an earthquake zone, or near a busy street, or in a zombie apocalypse, or in Siege. Longevity is always something I take very seriously with my figures. If something is going to break down over time and cause issues with stability, I consider that a failure in my book. Especially with collector grade products too. These are expensive investments. You're putting a hefty down payment on this shit. You expect it to last well into the future. As such, a lot of the goodwill I had towards this mode is lost. The multiple highs clash with this extreme low and cancel each other out into a robot mode that's honestly just okay. I can see the potential for a perfect representation of the character at this scale with but a few small tweaks. All they had to do was implement the simpler hinge that the Legends one had and hey presto, figure fixed. But no, they had to be as accurate as possible. They failed to realize that at such a scale, sacrifices have to be made with the accuracy in order to facilitate a better experience. Accuracy and Legends can potentially go hand in hand, but you have to know the hardware and you have to know the point where enough is enough. Otherwise, things just crumble under the weight of the designer's hubris. Again, I can't call this mode bad by any means. It looks great, sizes up well with most modern Legends, and poses decently for the time. It's just, the shoulders are unacceptable. This should not have been a thing. Ah well, guess I should cover accessories. You get 3 extra sets of fists, covering pointing, open hands, and grasping motions. The last of these allow you to access the included rifle, or at least it's supposed to. This rubber doesn't really catch onto the handle, so it doesn't work that well. At least it still works with the backpack, and the backpack works well enough. Yes, you have to swap out the head, but at this size I can't imagine getting the flip out ears to work. Either way, it works as advertised. Can't say the same for the heel supports though. These are pretty loose, which is annoying given how integral they are for stability. Still, this mode was never the most posable on the original, so realistically you're not going to get that dynamic with it. It should do well enough. Yes, it's disappointing that it lacks the sheer presence of the original, but hey, ultimately it does what it's set out to do. And that's why I feel so conflicted about this figure. As a standalone release, I can't really rate it very low. There's a lot of good and a lot of bad, and those factors clash in the middle to reveal a, well, middling release. It's definitely not worth the aftermarket prices, but if you can get it for a solid 150 like I did, and you really need this figure in your collection, then sure, go for it. But don't hype this up as one of the greatest Legends figures to ever release. It's old and it's got a lot of jank. In this day and age, there's a metric ton that could be improved with him. Only thing is, no one's putting in the effort, because at present it's all eyes on the G1 cast. Another reason to call upon 3D designers to make a trailer for the Legends version. Come on mate, give us the goods! Speaking of, if you're looking for a fun desk toy that's also a small version of Cybertron Prime, I'd just go for the Legends version. It's a much more solid piece at a fraction of the price and comes in several flavors to choose from. I was actually supposed to cover it in this year's Victory Lap, but we all know how that turned out. In the meantime though, hybrid-style Galaxy Convoy provides an interesting glimpse into why the line flopped so hard out of the gates. It's important to remember that Cybertron Prime was the first release in the series, and G1 Prime followed. Yes, in a vacuum this figure works well enough, but under the shadow of the original, it just doesn't compare. Cybertron Leader Class Optimus Prime is a statement of intent. This is the culmination of the Unicron trilogy, even if it wasn't really a trilogy in Japan. Hybrid style doesn't really capture that, and as a result, you're kinda left cold. Then combine that with the intent of this design. Not a lot of it lends itself to play. Sure, it has all the gimmicks from the original, but it really shines in a static pose on a shelf. To kind of put it in a metaphor, it's sort of like ordering oysters kill Patrick, but they arrive and the chef has used barbecue sauce instead of Worcestershire. It's perfectly edible and it doesn't taste too bad, but it's not really what you were expecting when you ordered it. And you're unable to taste the base flavor, that being the oysters. Or in the instance of the figure, you lose sight of the core values of Legends figures, that being the fun factor. I'm aware in recent months people have been criticizing my assertion that Legends figures should be primarily play-based, claiming that many people prefer the display aspects. While I'm aware that's part of the fun for some people, I'm not sure that subset of fans is as big as people make it out to be. When developing a collection for display, countless times I've seen people go with Chug or Masterpiece for the simple fact that it looks better on a shelf. When you remove the play factor from Cybertron Prime, all you have is the display factor, and for that, a Legends figure cannot compete with a full-scale leader class. What incentivized people to try out this line when a better version in almost every conceivable way already exists at a fraction of the price? And then G1 Prime comes along and, well, you know the rest. From this point, hybrid style was officially dead. Cybertron Prime didn't give people a reason to get on board, and G1 Prime murdered any interest in cold blood through his shittiness. This is how a line fails in 2 mere entries, and that is a perfect example of how you don't get a second first impression. You gotta make it count when you start things out. Iron Factory did with their release of Slammer and Six Gun. New Age did with their release of Bumblebee. Hasbro did with both the Legends of Cybertron and the recent Core class. Hybrid style flat out didn't, and although in a vacuum this figure is serviceable despite its issues, no figure exists in such. But as always, fan and public consciousness is a conversation, so drop your thoughts on the hybrid style line below. Do you have interest in these 2 releases, even knowing their issues? Do you feel the Unicron trilogy has a future in the small scale, or do 3P companies have too much of a hard-on for G1? And as always, there's a context for everything. Sorry this couldn't be part of the Legendary Marathon proper, but regardless, Till next time. What's that noise? Why is it getting louder? Oh no! Ah, fuck!